Hello and welcome to the Ag Culture Podcast, where we cultivate tomorrow by inspiring agripreneurs and ag innovators through real-life perspectives in agriculture. I'm Paul Windemuller, your host on this journey of exploration and growth. On today's episode, I play the second part of the interview that I did with Sam Watson-Jones. If you didn't listen to the first part, go back to the episode from last week, listen to that. It's a wealth of knowledge on Sam's journey and perspective on their family farm business. This week's episode, we're going to talk about his journey and experience in a startup ag tech company called the Small Robot Company that he helped found in England, and eventually what had happened to that company. As last week, I'm sure you'll get a lot of wisdom out of the things that Sam and I discuss on this episode. So please sit back and enjoy today's episode. Hey everyone, before we get started with today's episode, I just wanted to take a second to thank our sponsors, Bank Barn. I love these guys and what they're doing to streamline banking and agriculture. They're helping to connect farmers and lenders so that today's farmers have more options no matter the size of operation. Check out bankbarn.io to learn more. Sam, now I want to go into something that, as you had mentioned in the episode earlier here, Small Robot Company, something that you're not in anymore. But that was one of those things that was kind of high risk, high reward potential. Do you want to tell us how you got started in that? I know you had mentioned earlier about your love for technology and that you had started out in the technology consulting. So walk us through your journey with Small Robot Company and what it was.
So the start for this was, I think, 2015 or 2016. And again, it's the mindset shifts that really dictate where your life goes, I think. I talked earlier about this idea of a portfolio and can you invest, can you spread the risk and invest in some high risk, high return stuff. Through that, I got involved for only small amounts of money, but involved in a group of angel investors. We were looking at investing in. This particular group was looking at investing in edtech, so technology for education, and I knew a couple of the people who were doing it. They said, come and get involved. And it was like a Dragon's Den style thing where you get a few companies that would come through and then you'd decide as a group which companies you were going to back, which was great, an experience I really enjoyed. As often happens, over a few beers in the evening on one of these things, one of the guys leading the group really started grilling me on what's the technology play in farming. There's got to be something. There's got to be a big trend that's going to happen, a new technology in farming. And I didn't really have a good answer for him, but it was one of those conversations that really kind of lodged itself in my brain, and I started to work away on thinking about what that could be. And at the time, I mean, it seems so long ago now, but at the time, people were just starting to talk about the potential for AI, for artificial intelligence, and I started to think about and look at how other industries were just being transformed by AI. At the time, there was a load of talk about, and it's strange now because it's just so commonplace we almost don't even think about it. But there was a lot of talk about how AI was being used in equity investing and investing on the public markets. And there was a lot of talk, and it was the development of things like Google Maps and how AI was supporting human decision making. And I started to think about, okay, well, why is that not happening in farming? What's missing? And then through various other conversations that were going on. I was interested in as well in robotics, and understanding what the impact for robotics could be. Didn't necessarily see the link between the two at the time, but then through there's one of the bigger agricultural universities in the UK, a university called Harper Adams, is just down the road from the family farm. They were doing a lot of work around robotics, precision farming, the future for the industry. And through a professor there, I got introduced to a guy called Ben Scott Robinson, who then very quickly we hadn't met before, but then became my co-founder in this venture, small robot company. And as happens with these things, we spoke a few times. We met up, and we decided, well, there's got to be something in this space, something about robotics, AI. I don't know what it is, but there's got to be something. And we just decided to give it a go. And it's funny how, on reflection, you can make decisions very quickly that actually potentially have an impact on your life. And little did I realize then that was going to be the next 7.5 years of my life was going to be working with Ben on this venture. So we set up this company. We were looking at robotics, but we were also particularly looking at how the robots were going to use AI. And so the full vision for what we were trying to build was, and these things, this didn't sort of emerge in a bolt of lightning. It was work that happened over a number of months and years, really. But the full vision of what we were working towards was this concept of per plant farming. So this is the idea that you can gather data across a field of crops. So we were focused squarely on arable farming, and you can get an understanding of the status of each individual crop. So the concept really was we wanted to move from managing a farm on a field by field basis. This field needs fertilizer, this field needs chemicals, this field needs harvesting, down to a plant by plant basis. This plant needs something doing to it, but the plant next to it might need something different doing to it. So that then split into this thing of per plant data. Can you gather data on every single plant in the field? Map that out, visualize that, turn that into something that is useful for a farmer to support a decision that a farmer is taking. And then can you then use that to enable per plant action? So can I do something to this plant? And then the plant that is next to it, I'm going to do something different to that plant. And in the full vision of this, that is up to and including harvest. So ultimately, can we use a technology like this to move away from the monoculture and get to the point where we are saying, right, this plant is ready for harvest. I'm going to go and I'm going to harvest that plant. But the plant next to it might be a different species, might be a different variety even of the same species, or it's a different crop. And I'm going to come back at another point and I'm going to harvest that. And the thinking there, I guess, was we'd established a farming system which was very much based around optimizing the machine. Our fields look very different to fields did 150, 200 years ago. Hedges have been taken out. They're sort of efficient square units, not in all parts of the world, but in many parts of the world. Trees have been removed, obstacles have been removed, because it's all about optimizing the performance of the sprayer, optimizing the performance of the tractor and the combine harvester. But what if you developed a farming system that was about optimizing the performance of the plant? And what would that look like? And what would the machines be that you needed to carry that out? And what would the other infrastructure that you would need around that? There was a really interesting journal piece that I read at that time, And apologies for your US listeners, I'm going to slip into talking about tons per hectare here. There's a trial plot being operated in the UK, which is a small area of ground which is managed in huge detail by highly qualified plant scientists. And on this trial plot, they had achieved a tonnage for wheat of 20 tons per hectare, which is about 300 bushels per acre. And the UK average back then and still today has been about the same for about 25 years, is about 8.5 tons per hectare, which I think is 125-ish bushels per acre. So we still yield pretty well in the UK, but there's a massive gap between, and that is the same plant. And this is the thing that really, I mean, it's the same genetics. It's exactly the same plant. It is grown outside. It is grown in the same weather conditions. It gets the same amount of sun and rain. It's the same soil. The only difference is the management. And in that trial plot, that plant is managed at the per plant level. They are microdosing their fertilizer. They're removing all weed competition immediately. They're doing it all manually, but they're doing everything that, they're not allowing any disease in there. But they're microdosing these things so that they are, the plant has every potential to yield to its genetic potential. And there is a massive gap. Those seeds are then packaged up, sent off to farmers, and farmers achieve, less than half of those yields in the commercial environment. So this was something that really landed for Ben and I when we were developing the concept of Small Robot Company. It said, well, if you can't scale that approach with human beings, of course, but you could potentially scale it with robotics and artificial intelligence. And if you had autonomous machines that were going out and gathering this data and then applying it in a highly accurate way, where could the world go in terms of reducing the amount of inputs required and increasing the productivity of the crops that we are growing? And it felt to us that this was the next farming revolution. That we'd gone through the benefits that were available to us through the green revolution and ag chems and fertilizer and mechanization as well. And we now needed the next boost, the next revolution to take farming into the future. So that's what we started to build.
So your goal with the Small Robot Company initially was really to build an entire ecosystem around changing farming practices, not just the information or the artificial intelligence aspect, but you were also looking at building the mechanization that was needed on the robot side as well, correct? So the robots, the information data gathering, and the AI.
Yes, and
that's a lot.
Yeah. As is obvious in hindsight, we tried to do too much. We had a very big vision for what we were going to do. We called the robots Tom, Dick, and Harry, and we had this vision of Tom is a data collection robot. Goes out, gathers the data, and then he sends that as instructions back to this AI brain that we called Wilma. Wilma would gather the data in, interpret it, turn it into something that was visually useful for the farmer, but then could also send instructions out to other autonomous robots, Dick and Harry in this instance, and Dick would be crop care and Harry would be precision seeding, and at some point potentially there's a harvesting robot as well. It was sort of a full vision of autonomous machines, new machines going out there doing things in a different way, and moving beyond just the data to a fully autonomous system that was going to be more productive and was going to use far fewer chemicals. So a massive vision. And in hindsight, I think we talked in the earlier episode about as you go through this entrepreneurial journey, maintaining some of that enthusiasm and that excitement about what you can achieve, but also tapering it with some reality and experience. I think that's a clear area where I was, naively blundering into this thing because I guess, and this again comes to, and we'll get on to what ultimately happened with Small Robot Company and what worked and what didn't work, but one of the things that we went into it with was the assumption that if we could sell the excitement of this vision, that A, we would be able to get people to come and work for us, and B, we would be able to raise the investment that would then make it happen. And when we started to do this in 2017, right at the start of 2017 was when we formed the company. The idea of, can you go into a field of wheat? We started with wheat because it's the main crop in the UK. Can you go into a field of wheat and can you individually identify every single plant in that field and geolocate it and gather different data sets on that plant? That had not only had that never been done in 2017, it was very uncertain as to whether that was even technically possible, because you are talking about millions of data sets geolocated in this field, and it had never been done. But I don't know. It was crazy to look back on it now. It didn't intimidate us at all. We were like, well, yeah, it's never been done, but it could be done. We just got to get the right brains working on it, get them excited about it, raise enough investment to make it happen, and we'll just make it happen. Because the benefits on the other side, if this worked, will be enormous, and the industry needs it. So some big assumptions there in the early days of Small Robot Company, and some of those things proved to be true, and some didn't. So it did prove to be true that actually, if you get the right brains on these things, that is technically possible, and incredibly bright and motivated and engaged people can do incredible things. And we worked out how to do that. And we mapped out fields, with regularity. And we go into a field and say, yeah, there's 23 million wheat plants in that field, and they're all individually identified. And we can actually send a machine out to, here's plant number 19,285,613, and we can send a machine out to that point to gather more data, or in time potentially do something at that point. And those data sets also had a lot of value. But what I think we didn't realize, and these are things that have only really become apparent to me through my Nuffield experience, we didn't realize how early we were in terms of how far ahead of reality, the reality of the farming industry, that vision was. We didn't realize how low the appetite would be for investing in Agtech companies in the UK. And I think we also didn't realize how much more the house is on fire in the UK than it is in other countries. One of the things that is more unique to the UK or to Northern Europe, perhaps, than I had appreciated before I travelled a bit more on the Nuffield was our yields have been the same for 30 years. We have high yields globally, but they grew steadily in terms of your bushels per acre from 1920 to 1990. They grew pretty steadily, and in fact, they 4x'd over that time period.
Over that 7
years. Since 1990, in this sort of region of Northern Europe, they haven't shifted. But of course, the costs to achieve those yields have increased every year. Your wages, dramatically, to the point that these businesses are not really viable and are reliant on subsidies in different forms. But we traveled to Brazil. Well, that's not the case in Brazil. And actually, they're still getting some benefits from mechanization. And each year, and and they've got more GM crops as well, growing in those parts of the world. But each year they are actually producing more. And I was fascinated, traveling through Saskatchewan. They're still achieving that in Saskatchewan as well. Yields are still increasing, and I think that was I didn't appreciate that. And that meant that the thing that we were solving for was a huge problem in the UK, but the UK doesn't really care. From a structural perspective, it doesn't really care. As in, agriculture is 1% of our GDP, if that, and therefore the investment capital that is there in the UK isn't looking at agriculture as an interesting area to invest in. It invests in the things that do make up a significant chunk of our GDP, which is financial technology, enterprise software services for professional services firms, e-commerce, media, things like that. That's where the VC money goes. It doesn't go into agriculture. And then when you try and talk to VCs overseas, in the US, in South America, they're not quite facing the same problems. And I think they will at some point. This is a trend that I think is going to catch up around the world, but I didn't really appreciate how far ahead of that reality we were in other parts of the world.
So timing is definitely key. But what about if you had taken the same concept to the Central Valley of California, being close to the VC money and being around high value crops? Is that something that you think could have worked in hindsight?
Worked is an interesting word, and success in this space is an interesting word. So as part of my travels, I went to Silicon Valley and I traveled through the Central Valley of California, and it was extremely interesting. Yes, I felt individually, I think we could have been more successful as a company. We could have raised more money. We could still have been going. We would have had a greater chance of success. But my primary sense from that trip to California was actually I don't think venture capital is working for agriculture. And this was an impression that was gathered over a few meetings with startups and with farmers that have interacted with startups. And I guess there's a number of different fronts that's apparent on. For farmers that are working with startups in the ag space, a great example of this is actually Chuck Barisic in Ontario, in Canada, who's worked with a lot of different startups, where he's seen those companies take venture funding. They've then been forced in certain directions and forced to pivot. There's huge pressure on revenue generation, perhaps before they're ready. And the result for the farmer has been a pretty dissatisfactory service, or services being started but then dropped. And actually, he hasn't seen any examples of these companies being led in the right direction by VC funding. When that was backed up by another conversation I had down in Central California with a very large veg farmer who had interacted with. It was just a fascinating conversation I had with him about where does innovation in agriculture come from. He has, because he's in California, because he's growing high value crops, he's got loads of startups that some have received decent amounts of VC funding and some haven't. But those are the only companies that he can interact with to develop innovation for farming. It's all these sort of semi-funded or underfunded or certainly very insecure companies who are desperately trying to develop something useful, and they've been told by Silicon Valley to go and focus on those high-value crops because it's the kind of Peter Thiel 0 to 1 philosophy of focus on a small niche to start with and then expand beyond that. The problem with that, of course, on the ground is this company is developing a cauliflower harvester or a spraying machine for lettuce. how that goes from that very, very small, very niche market. How many cauliflower growers are there in the US? I don't know, but it's about 10 to 15. I don't know. Like it's a tiny amount of people who are doing it at scale. How you then convert success in that field into $1 billion company is very, very unclear, because you've probably got to build something totally different to get into corn and soy and whatever, and those big markets. An interesting line he said to me, this farmer, was, John Deere aren't building the next cauliflower harvester. They couldn't care less about this market because it's just too small. They are only focused on the billion-dollar markets, the multi-billion-dollar markets. It's the cotton, corn, soy, maybe wheat. Those big markets where they can make big returns. So innovation in agriculture is coming into those sectors, but the farmer's experience is very, very poor. Partly you get, on one hand, you get companies pivoting, services being started but then being dropped. On the other hand, even when you get success from a VC and from an entrepreneur's perspective, such as a company being acquired, which has happened to this guy, he was working with Blue River very closely, and Blue River were then acquired, and he'd invested a lot of time and a lot of money working with Blue River. Blue River were then acquired by John Deere, 2018, I think, and then immediately shut down all the work that they were doing on veg, because it was then pivoted towards what ultimately became See and Spray, and it was pivoted towards those big markets. So the experience for the farmer was terrible. And so then you think about, okay, where have the really big innovations in agriculture come from? They've come from these big companies. It's auto steer. It is individual nozzle control on sprayers, and those are things that are used in on those huge markets. But that, I think, is a big problem for the industry. If the innovation only comes from you're talking 3 or 4 big companies, and it only comes into certain sectors, that's a problem, because it's not really then benefiting. It's a problem for farmers for sure, because it's not benefiting them at all. It's not primarily benefiting them. It might benefit them as a side benefit, but it's about protecting John Deere's revenues and CNH's revenues, and bolstering what they already have. It is not about really solving fundamental farm problems. And I also think it is a problem for the wider farm industry, because all these other sectors are benefiting from new entrants, disruptive, big thinking startups who come in, create something entirely new that takes it to a different level and enables a whole new load of capabilities. And if farming doesn't have that, if it's not possible for a new company to come in, create, stand as an independent business, create something new that people want to use, and build and successfully sell products and build a big business off the back of it, that's a big problem, I think, for the long-term future of the industry. So I don't think that VC funding works, and I think that it doesn't work because it needs to see returns more quickly than I think is realistic for a farming business. I think where acquisitions have happened, they have happened for reasons that have very little to do with the company that is being acquired and much more to do with the company that is doing the acquisition. You look at the Blue River valuation, you look at the Bear Flag Robotics valuation. They weren't based on a multiple of revenues or anything like that. They were just based on, the acquiring company, and that in both of those instances it happens to be John Deere. The acquiring company needed to communicate something to Wall Street about its progress in a particular area, and therefore acquired these businesses. I'm not saying they were bad businesses, but they weren't. But it wasn't that they weren't acquired for kind of fundamental, even particularly fundamental IP reasons, and certainly not fundamental financial reasons. They were required to communicate a particular message, and the VC money is much better suited to the things where VC money has been successful. It has been successful in the classics of Facebook, Meta, Google, Airbnb, the software businesses that can grow at 10% a month and can then enable a quick growth and generate a quick return for those investors. So it's something that has been bubbling away in my mind for a while. Has been, I do think we need a different source of funding, and we need different expectations of returns.
Do you see any type of model that could work?
This is very early days in terms of this thinking, but I think more of the money needs to come more directly from farmers, and potentially other points in the supply chain as well, potentially food companies, farm retail maybe. But I think that there are fundamental on the ground problems that these companies are trying to solve. And I think there is a method of, and this is not brand new thinking. This works and has been established in more so in the US than elsewhere, but that brings farmers as investors, bringing the capital together with the companies, so that those companies are much more focused on solving farmer problems, much less focused on going out and raising investment from people who frankly don't really understand the industry and will then, and these VCs, they really don't understand the industry. And that capital that is then being introduced into their companies is much more patient, much more long-term in its view. And I think there is some kind of a venture studio model that I'm interested in building. And again, this is not a brand new idea. This sort of model exists, but where you're having farmers as the primary shareholders in this company, in this studio, they're taking an equity stake in these startups. What the startups get out of it is they get to focus the vast majority of their time on solving farmer problems and building technology that really works for farmers. And they get to, as opposed to rather spending, when I was running a small robot company, I spent 90% of my time trying to raise funds and doing all sorts of magical dances in front of VCs that wanted to see a particular thing and trying to communicate that it was, it was this and it was that. And not spending enough time talking to customers, talking to farmers, and actually working on solving problems. So for the startups, you're giving them more of that time back to actually solve, bring their engineering talent to bear and solving those farmer problems. For the farmers, they're getting to direct these companies, come up with the ideas that focus these companies truly on solving their problems, and they're also getting that diversity idea that we talked about. They're getting exposure to the kind of high risk, high return stuff. But what you're trying to build in the long term is, I think, independent companies that either remain as privately owned companies that are owned by farmers and others in the industry, and they pay out in the form of dividends, or companies that are strong enough to get to an IPO of some sort in the long run. And whilst acquisitions are not a dirty word, and you're not trying to avoid them at all costs necessarily, I haven't seen one yet that has worked for everyone involved. I've seen some that have worked for some of those early investors and the entrepreneurs, but then the farmer customers often get left in the dust because whatever work was going on their farm, unless it directly aligns with the needs of that acquiring company, it gets mothballed. So there's something that I'm starting to think about working on there bringing together investment capital from the industry with engineering talent, trying to bring those two things together to really focus on solving farmer needs. Because I think that individually, not many farmers have the ability to really provide the capital that is required to solve these problems. But collectively, I think they do. And if it can be brought together in the right way, I think there is something that can work for all sides. But yeah, one of my primary conclusions traveling around has been venture capitalists are not the answer in this sector. I don't think they're bad in other sectors at all, but in this sector, I just don't think it works.
So going back to the point of acquisition, companies that get acquired by John Deere or Bayer or some of these really, really large players in agriculture, is there a differentiation between a company that's trying to make more of a complementary technology or product to those companies versus a tech company that's looking to really just disrupt the sector?
Yes, because the second one doesn't get acquired. So the journey of Small Robot Company. I'm going to try not to answer this in too many minutes. But the journey of Small Robot Company was we were never successful on raising venture capital funding, even though we tried forever to do it. Throughout the whole existence, we were trying to do it. We existed through crowdfunding and grant funding, and we got enough to just keep us going, just keep us going, just keep us going. We then reached a point in 2023 where we'd sort of hit the buffers on that. We'd gone as far as we really could on crowdfunding, and we had to either be acquired or land some significant VC funding to get us to that point where, so we were in the classic startup valley of death, where we had working technology, paying customers, and a product that worked, that people wanted, but our revenues were not enough to cover our monthly burn. And so we needed investment to cover the gap from where we were to profitability. And that was the thing that ultimately killed us, was we set ourselves up in a way that we had to we either raised VC funding or we died, and we didn't raise VC funding, so we died. As part of the struggle at that point, we spoke to a number of so we spoke directly to these big agriculture companies about acquiring us, and we also spoke to, and we got sort of interest, and oh yeah, maybe, but no proper bites. But the most informative conversation, perhaps, that I had in my whole time at Small Robot Company was with a broker based in the US, whose whole business was around selling agriculture businesses into the big agriculture players. And he said something which really stayed with me, because it was terminal for Small Robot Company, but also because I just thought it was so interesting and I just hadn't thought about it before. Firstly, he said, guys, what you've built here is amazing. It's way more interesting than most of the stuff I look at. And I think that I genuinely believe what you have built is the future of agriculture, which was the nice bit to hear. The next bit wasn't so good, because he then said, but I'm not going to represent you because you're not going to get acquired. And the reason you won't get acquired is you're too early. The way that companies get acquired is if they are building exactly what is on the product roadmap and exactly what is currently being built at a big company. They will look at you and decide if they can accelerate that roadmap by acquiring you. So if they are currently spending R&D dollars on building exactly the thing that you are building, and they look at what they're doing and go, well, we're at stage 2, but this startup over here is at stage 5. We can accelerate that. We can accelerate that path from stage 2 to stage 5 by just acquiring them today. Then you get acquired. If you're building the next horizon thing, which they might be thinking about and talking about, but they're not actively spending money on it, you won't get acquired. And the reason for that is that there is a human being behind that number, that headline number that, Blue River get acquired for $305 million, whatever it is. That means that an executive at John Deere has put their name to a $305 million acquisition. And if that doesn't work, that is a millstone around their neck for the rest of their career. So they are going to take as little risk as they possibly can during that acquisition process. They have to be absolutely certain that John Deere are building exactly this thing, and it is going to be protective or additive to their existing product portfolio in these ways, countless ways that have already been thought through and gone through every committee stage, and the budget has already been approved. If they look at a small robot company and go, well, it could be, maybe it's the future of farming, but maybe it's not. Or maybe it is the future of farming, but it's in 20 years' time, which is the same thing from their perspective as it's not the future of farming. Because if it doesn't work, or if it takes too long to work, and both those things, that's the same thing, then that's the end of their career as a top level, M&A executive in agriculture, because they signed off on whatever check. Doesn't matter if it's 20 million or 10 million, they signed off on it, and it took too long to pay off, and so they're not going to take the risk, which means that you then map that out into. So that was the end of that conversation. I was like, okay, yeah, right, we are in
your heart
big
kind of
trouble.
sank, huh?
Yeah, and so then it was a case of that was the acquisition conversation basically done, and then it was a case of, can we land an investor? Oh, we're going to land one. Oh, these guys have signed up. Oh no, they haven't actually got the money, and it was a torturous, further 6 months of conversations in which people promised to give us money and then didn't give us money. So it was all very painful. But the implications for the industry of that are that incremental innovation gets acquired and gets the investment. Transformative innovation does not, or does not achieve success by being acquired because it's too risky. As part of my Nuffield, an interesting little exercise I did was I looked at the 10 biggest companies in the world, and then the 10 biggest agriculture companies in the world. And so the 10 biggest companies, not to name them all, but Microsoft and Apple and Tesla and Nvidia and TSMC, and the oldest of those companies is 50 years old. In the 10 biggest companies by market cap, which means they were all startups relatively recently. They've all come in with a brand new something that didn't exist or didn't exist in the form that they have developed it, and they've turned it into a massive business, one of the biggest businesses in the world. In agriculture, there's been a few mergers that have created a new entity like an Agco, or a Syngenta, but the underlying companies, I don't think there's any that are younger than 100 years, and most of them are more than 150 years old. These are very, very old businesses that have been around forever and have been the beneficiaries of the Green Revolution and turned themselves into really good businesses. But that means that no business in that entire time, that 100 to 150 year span, has successfully entered the market and turned itself into a really substantial player. The only new companies that have been created have been through mergers of older companies. That is a desperate thing. When you think of all the benefit to our lives of Microsoft and Apple and Nvidia and Tesla and so on, the benefit to our lives, the benefit to the world, and we're not getting that benefit in agriculture. We are getting very established, very old companies who are trying to protect what they have. I don't think that I'm not saying they're evil corporations or anything like that, and the people within them are wonderful people. But that is natural human instinct. You have an established business. You're going to protect what you have, which means that you're not going to think in transformative and disruptive ways. Because why would you? Why would you cannibalize yourself? And equally, or as much as that, you're probably a public company. How do you communicate that to the market? Are we going to do something that's going to make our business substantially worse for 10 years? But don't worry about it, because beyond that 10 years, we're going to be unbelievably brilliant. You can't communicate that. So we don't get the same level of innovation and transformation in agriculture, and I think that is a massive problem for the industry. We need startups in this space, but we've got to work out the right way to fund them. Otherwise we won't get it. Is my view.
Yeah, well, those are some amazing insights that I haven't thought of in the past. And the exercise of looking at the 10 largest companies in agriculture, that's very intriguing. Do you think it's that way mainly because of the long-term time horizon in agriculture, from everything from planting, looking at each season is a unit of time, which in the startup world is an eternity, right? Is that the main issue that is the roadblock for seeing that expansion and investment?
Yes, I think that is probably one of the main reasons. I think that's probably the main reason that, when I said earlier, I don't think venture capital funding works for this sector. I think that's probably the primary reason. Particularly if you're looking at stuff to support growing crops, as we are, you get to test that technology at a particular growing point once a year, once every 12 months. Whereas so your product development cycle is 12 months long. Whereas if you're developing an enterprise software company or your Airbnb or something like that, you could release a new version of your product every few weeks, every few days if you wanted to. And you get to test that, find out what works in the market, iterate much, much more quickly. So I think that's the primary reason that this has received so little venture funding. And I think that's probably the primary reason that there hasn't been these successful startups, because they're so difficult to fund, and those are the guys that have that capital to deploy. And then it also makes it means that there are barriers to entry in this market that are not there in other markets. And when you have the complication of getting a chemical made or a new genetic strain approved for the market, the R&D spend required to achieve that, and then the distribution network to get that out to the market. This could be chemicals, fertilizer, seed genetics, machinery. It applies to all of those sectors, I think. The R&D spend is huge. The distribution costs are huge. The servicing costs of right now your things out in the market, out in the field. How do you communicate with your customers if that works or it doesn't work, and support them with an ongoing service? That's really, really difficult, and we struggled with that as an operating company. In a geographically, basically a pretty small geographical area in the south of England. We weren't operating at any big scale, but we were over 13 or 14 farms, and even that was really difficult. So you think about serving a nation with your technology. It's hard. But I don't think hard is the same as impossible. I think there are lots of reasons why it hasn't happened. But I think that these new things do need to happen. And I think it's very difficult, as I've said, for an existing company to build something totally new. Now, an area that is interesting, that's a very different economy, but I've just come back from China. And what's interesting over there is So yeah, there's a lot more government involvement. There's a lot more government funding, and there's a lot more sort of top down thinking. But they have actually managed to develop some really interesting new innovations as spin-outs from existing companies, from existing large companies that then, through a spin-out, establish a new entity that is then funded largely funded with government funding. It's a very difficult country to. I was there for 18 days. It's pretty difficult to get a thorough understanding of China in 18 days, I think. But I did see examples of companies that had had huge success. A particular one that I saw was developing AI in the pig livestock management sector. So using visual data and then AI algorithms to support decision making in livestock management. And they were a spin out. They had raised over $100 million, and they had, and none of it was from venture capital funding. It was from, so they were a spin out from a larger company that was already established, but not delivering anything in terms of technology, but already established in the pig sector. And they were set up specifically to try and exploit and explore the opportunity around this technology. And then once they had established success, they then were able to raise a lot of local government funding, because the local government thought they were going to create plenty of jobs in their province, which they did. So there's a lot going on there around connections into government. And if you don't have connections into government, what happens? Well, you probably don't get to build the company, and then building off the back of an established business. I'm not really sure what the West can take from that, but I mean, part of what we take is, we shouldn't underestimate what's going on in China, and they've established a totally different model. I don't think they have the same tolerance for failure and for that sort of entrepreneurial, risk taking that we have. Certainly not in the conversations that I had. But they are bringing new technologies and new companies into this market that are establishing a very significant foothold and even market-leading potential through a totally different way of doing things. And it is some of the ingredients that I think we could take there are long-term time horizons, and when you can see that there is the possibility for a winner, they put significant amounts of capital to work. Something that we've certainly been guilty of in the UK is we would much rather put a very small investment into 20 businesses to sort of see if they can experiment than put all of it into one business to really back a winner. And I can see good reasons for doing that. I'm particularly talking about the government funds in the UK. They're very careful about spreading the bets, but you end up having almost no impact because the amount of capital that each of those companies is getting is so small. And in China, they have none of those scruples. I didn't obviously see the companies that had failed, and I didn't really get the stories of those companies that had failed. But once they establish a winner, bang, they back it with tens of millions at an early stage. And this company, as I say, depressing. So we were founded in 2017. This company was founded in 2019. They'd raised over 100 million. They had 700 employees. They'd established a market-leading position in the pig sector, and they were looking about how they were going to expand that. Firstly across China, but then into other sectors, and in other countries. As far as I could see, and I don't know totally whether I didn't really get the chance to sort of verify everything I was being told, but from what I was told, it was a raging success story. And I think that's interesting, as a contrast to how we've built things.
So outside of China, you had mentioned you went to Central Valley of California and across Canada. Where else have you taken your Nuffield travels, and where do you continue to plan on going?
So then Brazil, where we were, got to spend a bit of time after the Nuffield conference in Brazil, travels across Mato Grosso, across some very, very, huge farming areas there, and then also around Sao Paulo. Smaller farms, but pretty intensively farmed still in that region. And China was my last big overseas trip, and now so we're in middle of July now, and I'm doing some smaller trips more locally in the UK and Northern Europe. But that's my big adventures done, and it's been an incredible experience, an intense experience, and I've spent, I think, just under 3 months out of the last 5 months away from home, away from the family, and away from the business, and that's been tough. It's felt like a long time at times, and I felt very far away from home and very foreign at a number of times too, and I've certainly been out of my depth. But it's really broadened my horizons. The way I see, and you're always aware, I think, when you do a Nuffield of what you haven't seen and how narrow even the experience that I've had, the narrow experience I had of Brazil and the narrow experience I had of China, which are two countries that I'd never visited before, is something you have to be aware of. But it has broadened my awareness of the world of agriculture just unfathomably, from where I saw the world in February to where I see the world in July. It's completely different, it's come at a funny time for me because I signed up for this when Small Robot Company was still very much a going concern, and this was going to be about exploring the next markets for this technology and how we were going to broaden out what we were doing and what the opportunities were out there in the world. And obviously, by the time I set off and met up with you in Brazil, Small Robot Company was no more. And so I've had to shift my perspective on what this is for. But it has, and so I'm less clear, I suppose, on what the immediate benefit is going to be. But I think the building of a network and the broadening of my horizons will pay off in the long run. I'm just not quite sure exactly what it's going to be yet, but I'll, as I have at other times in my life, I'll work that out as I go.
So, Sam, just to wrap up here, where can people get a hold of you to find out more about what you're doing and maybe be a part of your Nuffield journey? And if they have a question on Agtech,
I'd love for people to contact me. First of all, really still, as I say, got some bumps and bruises, but very excited about the future of Agtech, and still very much want to be part of it. So you can find me on LinkedIn, Sam Watson Jones, but you can also just send me an email. Is probably the best way to get hold of me, and that is Sam, SAM, at Howle Manor, HOWLE Manor, MANOR.com, which is the family business. I'm very happy to speak to anyone about Agtech or diversifying the farm business, and hear about people's journeys in this space themselves.
Well, great. I'll put that in the show notes for anyone that wants to get in touch with you. And again, Sam Watson Jones, thank you so much for being here. It's been a pleasure.
I've loved it, Paul. Thank you very much.
Well, that's the end of the interview that I had with Sam Watson Jones. If you haven't done it yet, go back to the first episode that I did with Sam and listen to his story of his farm business and his mentality and mindset for his family farm business. And if you would like to get a hold of Sam, check out our show notes. We'll have his contact information in there. He's a wealth of knowledge, especially when it comes to ag tech and understanding the potential for artificial intelligence in agriculture in the future. That's his Nuffield Scholars topic. And if you're interested in checking out more about Nuffield International, you can get a hold of me. You can check out Nuffield International's website. It's a great program that both Sam and I are in. I just want to put a plug in here for that. It's something that's really made a big impact in my life, and I know in a lot of other people's lives. So with that, I just want to thank you for listening. Again, reach out to Sam, and if you found value out of this episode, like I'm sure you have, please share it with somebody that you know that would also find value from it. And until next week, I'm Paul Windemaller, and this has been the Ag Culture Podcast. Thanks for listening.